Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Let me introduce the speaker for today. Dale Borglum has been with GBF many times and has this very impressive resume of service and contemplation, which I want to share with you. Dale is the founder and executive director of the Living Dying Project. He is a pioneer in the conscious dying movement and has worked directly with thousands of people with life-threatening illnesses and their families for over 30 years. In 1981, Dale founded the first residential facility for people who wish to die consciously in the United States, the Dying Center. He's taught and lectured extensively on the topics of spiritual support for those with life-threatening illness, caregiving as a spiritual practice, and healing at the edge of illness, death, loss, and crisis. He's also wrote The Journey of Awakening, a Meditator's Guidebook, and has taught meditation for the past 35 years. Welcome, Dale.
Thank you for the great introduction. Today I would like to talk about two kinds of love. A couple of months ago, a dear friend of mine, one of my meditation group members, called and said that she had what was possibly a very serious cancer that might take her life in very short order. So I invited her to come over and we talked about her fear. She's a longtime meditator, a PhD psychologist, and yet with this immediate news that she had this cancer and the cancer potentially could kill her very soon, she was very frightened. We talked about fear for a long time and ways to work with fear, ways to heal fear, ways to utilize her fear. And after she left, I realized we had really never talked about healing, spiritual healing. And I started thinking about that. I put together a podcast about that. I do have a podcast channel that has this particular talk on that I'm talking about, a lot of other talks. Be Here Now Network, Ram Dass's network, BeHereNowNetwork.com. And I'd like to talk about, first of all, the process, the art, the practice of spiritual healing, one kind of love. When I was younger and a lot of spiritual teachers were coming through the Bay Area, I would go and hear these lamas and these Zen teachers and these yogis, and I would ask everybody my standard question. And the standard question was, if I had a friend who was dying, and this friend had not really meditated much and was afraid of dying, what would be the best thing I could do for this person? And the best answer I got from most of the people was essentially merge your mind with the one mind and then merge your mind with the mind of your client. In Tibetan Buddhist practice, they say very clearly that the most advanced healing practice is Dzogchen, resting in the non-dual. So that if we're resting in the non-dual, if we're merging our mind with the one mind or the higher power or the mind of Buddha or Christ, Buddha nature, then we're going beyond any resistance we have to allowing healing to happen. There still is karma, and everybody's going to die one day. Ramakrishna, Suzuki Roshi, Ramana Maharshi, all these wonderful teachers everybody dies eventually. So healing doesn't mean you're not going to die. Healing means you're going to become whole, and this wholeness may be becoming more whole in terms of physical curing, but it might be healing into death, healing into life, or healing into death. That's up to God or karma or the universe or whatever you want to call that. So if you have an illness, if a friend of yours does, if something's really out of balance, it's difficult not to get caught up in dealing with that out of balance place. You've got cancer in your pancreas or in your lung or somewhere like that. Is it possible to not be fixated on what needs to be fixed, but surrendering into wholeness, dying into love, if you will? And I used to have a osteopath who would work on my neck. I have a injured neck. It was a meditation injury, if you can believe that, but it's a whole other story that we don't need to go into. But anyway, I had this guy, Dr. Ed. He had an office in Albany, and he was a very sophisticated healer. Eventually, though, he moved to Los Angeles, but he would come up to Albany occasionally to treat people. So my neck went out in this really painful way, and I called him up and said, Dr. Ed, are you coming up this week? And he said, no, I'm not, but I could heal you over the telephone. And I thought, I'm not going to pay this guy to be adjusting my neck over the telephone. That sounds crazy. So I went to somebody else who wasn't as good. And then a couple months later, the same thing happened. I said, well, why don't I try this? And he said, well, just lie down on your bed for half an hour. And when we're done there, you just get up and send me $100. So I said, okay. I lay in my bed, and after half an hour, my neck was adjusted. My body felt balanced, and the energy all cleaned out. And I was pretty impressed with that. And eventually, he and I became friends, and we were having lunch one day. I said, well, how do you do that? And he said, well, I just go into wholeness. I don't even want to know what's wrong with you. I don't care if it's your C3 or your lumbar spine or whatever it is. You don't have to tell me any of that. I just go into wholeness, and then I merge with you. And I figured, why do I have to pay him $100 to go into wholeness? Why can't I do that myself? Right? So eventually I got to the point where most of the time I can heal my own neck, not by adjusting anything, but just by lying down and going into this place of complete wholeness. So there's this wonderful Indian saint, Ramana Maharshi. Many people were healed around him. He was a great healer. And one time a stranger came to the place where he was and said, Ramana, I hear you're a great healer, and I'm really sick. Could you please heal me? And Ramana Maharshi said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I am not a healer. You got the wrong guy. And the man said, no. Many people say you're this great healer. Could you please heal me? And Ramana said, no, I'm not a healer. There's some confusion here. And finally, one of Ramana's disciples heard this conversation, and he said, Ramana, what the man is saying is that healing happens through you. And Ramana said, oh, healing happens through me, but I'm not the healer. He was so disidentified with thinking that he was the agent of healing that when this stranger accused him of being a healer, he didn't know what the guy was talking about. So is it possible to have a deep enough practice that at least at times we can have a love that is so unconditional that we go beyond the differences, we go beyond the impurity, and we see that which is whole? That's really the point of being around the guru. Maharaji, my guru, said very clearly, I see no impurities. Ram Dass came to him one day and was all upset about something or another. And he said, Maharaji, I feel so impure. Ram Dass had him stand up and turn around. And he said, I don't see any impurities. So that there I was also feeling at times neurotic and horny and inadequate and all different kinds of things. He just kept seeing the place in me that I was whole, which was an incredibly transformative experience. Maharaji also said it is a mistake to teach by looking at individual differences. You teach by looking at the wholeness. But, and in fact, in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a practice called Guru Yoga, where we visualize the embodiment of wholeness, whether it's Amitabha Buddha or Gautama Buddha or Christ or the Mother or Hanuman or whoever it might be, and you just merge with that being. You visualize this being as the manifestation of pure consciousness, and you merge with that consciousness. And in fact, we are that pure consciousness. There is no difference between what I am made of and what the Guru is made of and what you are made of. It's all pure consciousness. So what I'm talking about is a little difficult here in the West, because the Western worldview, which now pretty much includes the whole world, the Western worldview is that you and I are separate perceiving entities, perceiving a solid objective reality out there through our eyes and our ears and our smell and our taste and our touch, that when I hold up my computer mouse, that we all see the same thing. And there's this thing here that's solid and objective and separable, which means that there's nothing in the world that's not connected to this. There's nothing deep in a coal mine in China that if I drop this on the floor is going to be not affected by me dropping the mouse. Everything is connected. Everything is just this manifestation of consciousness. So that this may sound kind of theoretical, but to the extent we, at least at times, realize that rather than stuff is coming, we're perceiving this solid reality, that we're creating reality. Moment to moment, there's this tantric understanding that it's all consciousness, it's all a divine form of the mother, or it's just pure consciousness. It's a lot easier to do this form of love, this first form of love that I'm talking about, which is the quality of resting in wholeness and allowing healing to happen. There is the danger of New Age guilt, that many people who are meditators or spiritual practitioners, they're sick, their friends are sick, they think, I'm going to do the healing thing, and the person dies, or the person is not getting better, and the practitioner then feels, I'm a bad practitioner, I'm not really creating any healing here. So can we not only be doing the practice, but watching how we respond to it, how we don't respond to it, how we may be feeling that I could be a better healer, something like that. Let me read one paragraph from a book called The Art of Spiritual Healing by a guy named Joel Goldsmith. He's one of these kind of Christian mystics from the 1950s in America. It's kind of patriarchal. It's kind of slightly weird language, but I think he says something really important. So I'd just like to read this one paragraph. It's Christian language, but I think we're all mature enough we can deal with that. As you move about this world, inevitably aware of its frustrations and tragedies, never treat anyone or any condition. Never. It is the claim that is presented to you that receives the treatment. And that claim is always the belief in the selfhood or condition separate and apart from God. So he's saying, you're not treating the person, you're not treating the illness, you're treating the belief that there's separateness, that there's not oneness. Instead of treating the problem, you merge with the one mind. Whenever any belief intrudes itself upon your thought, You must do something about it, not something to the person or the condition, but only to the claim as it presents itself to your thought. When you see what looks like deformity, insanity, or accident, go within. Feel the divine peace of God's presence. Every specific claim that presents itself to you has to be met in your consciousness, not only when people ask you for help, but whenever you observe a need. When you pass by the beggar on the street, do not just let him be there. Physically, you may pass him by, but spiritually lift him up to the truth of being. When you look out at the world and see persons or circumstances claiming to have power over you for good or evil, you again must acknowledge that your being is in God, and only the God-inspired can have influence in your affairs. So we can translate those words out of the theistic. We don't have to believe in God to really get the essential message that Joel Goldsmith is presenting here, that as long as we're buying into, you've got cancer, you're a cancer patient, you're a dying person, you're a crazy person, you're a poor person, and I've got to fix you, or I don't have to fix you. As long as we're focusing on the broken, that the level of healing that's happening is very limited. And I'm sure many of you have read books about all the miracles that happen around great saints. There's so many stories of people being healed around Maharaji or other people, other gurus and saints. And it's not that they were doing it, as that Ramana Maharshi story really so perfectly exemplifies, that instead they were just resting in wholeness, and the wholeness itself was allowing healing to happen. Okay, so now there's another kind of love, though. There's a more human love. There's loving somebody in a moment way. So that after I started exploring this idea with my friend who had this cancer that thankfully turned out to be not as serious as the doctors had first expected, even though it involves her pancreas, it looks like treatment is going to be successful. But after we had started talking and I started doing this practice, and I picked a few of my friends, I didn't really tell them, but I started doing a practice where I would just say my mantra. I would go into this wide open hearted space and think about a person. Not that I was fixing them, but just that I was merging with pure consciousness, with God as directly as I could. The way I was doing it was saying my guru mantra, and then thinking about a person, not thinking about where they're stuck or what's broken, but just thinking about God, thinking about them, and kind of smushing that together in some kind of way. And people's lives started changing a little bit. And I started going into this mildly blissful state. I was resting in this wide open love. But then I got a little caught in all this, I will confess. And one friend in particular, I thought, well, now that we're becoming deeper friends, maybe I can help fix her a little bit. Maybe I can give her some useful advice, which she did not like at all, right? And I realized that this quality of living in wholeness, maybe Maharaji can do it, maybe Ramana Maharshi can do it. I'm not ready to do that 24/7 yet. I still see what's broken in the world, right? It pops up all the time, right? And so I then started thinking about what's the difference between day-to-day loving somebody and this art of spiritual healing. And right about that point, I got an email from maybe it was Tricycle or Lions Roar, one of these Buddhist organizations that keeps sending out wise things all the time. And it was a article by Thich Nhat Hanh. And he said, understanding is love's other name. Understanding is love's other name. And what he was meaning by this is that you can't really love somebody in a day-to-day way unless you understand all of them, how they're suffering. Basically, what he was saying is that you can't love somebody without compassion. So what I was doing in this first case of this spiritual healing thing was jumping over all the compassion stuff and forgetting about how somebody was suffering, going right to the place of healing. But that's not something that I, or probably any of us in this room, can do 24/7. That we see how people are caught. We are attempting to bring skillful means to the situations in our lives. So I really began to see that I couldn't love this friend in particular, but really all my friends, unless I had compassion for the places that they were suffering. And I couldn't have compassion for them unless I had compassion for those same places in myself. That I could not have compassion for how angry my friend was getting in traffic if I didn't have compassion for how angry I was getting in traffic, right? If we go back to Tibetan Buddhism, they say very clearly that the two pillars of practice are wisdom and compassion. Compassion without wisdom is mushy and fragile. Wisdom without compassion is dry and brittle. I work with a lot of dying people, with healthcare professionals, and there's this notion, compassion fatigue. I'm around suffering a lot, somebody might say. I'm all day long, I'm a nurse at San Francisco General, for instance. I'm seeing people dying from COVID, from cancer, whatever it might be. And I have compassion fatigue. I'm trying to be compassionate, but I'm getting exhausted. My humble opinion is there is no such thing as compassion fatigue. The nature of the heart is boundless, it's spacious, it's connected, the open heart. And compassion fatigue is really almost compassion fatigue, or fake compassion fatigue, or I hope I could be more compassion fatigue, right? If we really are compassionate, there is not going to be fatigue. But for almost all of us, the compassion is only going to be partial. There are qualities of suffering that we resist, that we judge, that our unwillingness to feel certain kinds of pain prevents us from being compassionate in certain areas of our lives. So compassion without wisdom is fragile, it's exhausting, it's mushy. And what is this wisdom that allows compassion to be solid? And then the solid compassion allows us to love another human being. Okay, so wisdom in Buddhism is based on primarily the three foundations of existence. The first one is the nature of suffering. If we really understand how suffering arises, we will feel compassion. If we don't really understand how suffering arises, if we think that somebody's suffering because they have cancer, if we think somebody is suffering because they're getting old and there's pain in their body, it's hard really to have compassion. If we understand that the person is suffering because they're resisting having cancer, they're resisting getting old and having pain in their body, then healing can begin to happen. Okay, so the first leg of this notion of wisdom is understanding suffering, the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha. And so often when suffering arises, we immediately, subconsciously, automatically fixate on the trigger that's causing the suffering. What the weather is like today, what the government is doing, what the government is not doing, what COVID is doing in my neighborhood, on and on and on. How bad the traffic is, how crazy my neighbor is, instead of what is my response right now. And in fact, in the Lojong teachings, one of the most wonderful slogans is drive all blames into oneself. It's not that you're blaming yourself, but as long as you're blaming something else out there, healing is not going to be able to happen. So that when you find that you're blaming the world instead of having responsibility, taking responsibility for how you're feeling, healing is not going to be happening. wisdom is not going to be happening. So beginning to notice your propensity to be bothered, to blame the environment, to blame your body, to blame your doctor, to blame your neighbor, to blame the government, whatever it might be. Okay. The second quality of wisdom is no self. We think there's a permanent self. I'm the one who's suffering. I'm the one that has compassion for that separate person over there. So we're mistaking no self for self. We're mistaking suffering for the causes of suffering. And the third thing is impermanence. We're mistaking impermanence for permanence. Maybe I've said it. We think it's permanent, it's impermanent. Whatever the language is there. Maybe I say these things backwards. You get what I'm saying? We create an illusory separate self. We mistake why people are suffering, how people are suffering, and we think things are permanent and we're solid and there's a solid reality. So to the extent we have this wisdom that's supported by compassion, the compassion supports the wisdom supports the compassion, and it creates a positive upward cycle of increased wisdom and increased compassion. There are three qualities to this open heart of compassion. One of them is a connected heart. I find that a very useful practice. Is my heart connected? Right now, is my heart connected to you? Is my heart connected to me? Is my heart connected to God or to consciousness, whatever you want to say? So there's this quality of connectedness. I'm having this ongoing conversation with a friend of mine, and I keep saying, when we're talking, I don't feel we're getting connected. I feel like there's a pulling away, and I really want to be connected. I don't care what we're talking about. I don't care about the content so much, but it's more the relationship. Compassion is about relationship. Am I feeling connected as we're having a conversation? I mean, we could be talking about, are the Giants going to win the division today, right? Probably a lot of people are concerned about that. We hoped it would happen yesterday. It didn't happen yesterday. One more chance, right? Okay. We could be talking about the weather. We could be talking about there's a lull in COVID. We could talk about, should I get the black glasses or the frameless glasses? But as we're doing that, are we connected? That's much more important than the content in a certain way. Dropping down out of the mind that's like playing with all the concepts and feeling this compassion supported by wisdom. And when compassion is supported by wisdom, compassion can be fierce. It doesn't mean that we're not going to be using skillful means to be changing things, to be protesting injustice in the world. His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, without the unity of wisdom and compassion, we can fall into despair. Think about that for a second. Without the unity of wisdom and compassion, we can fall into despair. And to me, it really is bringing in the quality of wisdom, that understanding how suffering's arising and that people need to learn to be with their suffering, to go beyond it rather than just automatically pushing it away. Ram Dass said something that I hated for the longest time. I knew it was right, but I still didn't like it. He said, suffering is grace. Nobody likes to hear that, right? But suffering is exactly happening in those places where we're not resting in this balance of wisdom and compassion. So in this other kind of love, the second kind of love, this loving someone in a moment-to-moment way, I am noticing how the other person is suffering. I'm not leapfrogging that as in the art of spiritual healing. I'm really being with another person's suffering. I'm being with my own suffering. I'm having compassion, which allows me then to keep loving. And I'm able to rest in compassion because there's this wisdom that suffering is not a mistake. Suffering is the perfect pointing at what we need to do to open our hearts in this next moment. And when we go more deeply into compassion in the ways that we're talking about here, we begin to appreciate the wrathful deities. I remember being in the shrine room there at the Buddhist center, and there's a big, beautiful Buddha statue. But in some other kinds of Buddhism, there are Buddhas that are not quite so friendly looking. In Hinduism, there's Shiva and Kali. In Buddhism, there's Mahakala and Vajrapani, and these deities that are a fierce manifestation, a wrathful manifestation of the divine presence. So that compassion has to include this fierce quality as well as this sweet protective quality. Okay, so we have another 15 minutes or so for conversation and questions and answers. Why don't we open this up to some discussion right now? I would love to hear your opinions about this almost spiritual bypassing into wholeness and spiritual healing versus day-to-day loving someone based on wisdom, based on compassion.
Hi, my name is Abel, and I have a question. So I have a situation where I have a sister who actually has a brain injury.
Uh-huh.
She got a brain injury 2 years ago during a surgery that went wrong, that shouldn't have gone wrong. And so this idea of healing and the challenges of healing hits home pretty deeply. And the truth is that I'm having difficulty with kind of the main teaching today. Resting in wholeness and the quality of living in wholeness seems very challenging with like the day-to-day difficulties of dealing with somebody with a brain injury, and dealing with a lawsuit and dealing with all the health care that's required and like finances. So I'm wondering if there's a way of like breaking down the main teaching and bringing it from that philosophy to how to work with things. For example, maybe how your friend who had the cancer diagnosis that turned out to not completely be cancer.
No, it was cancer. It just wasn't it wasn't quite as serious as the doctor initially expected. I mean, she's getting radiation and chemotherapy and everything, but
I guess my main question is like, I know I'm having difficulty accepting the teaching.
Yeah.
As it relates to having this overwhelming situation where I want to be into the healed process. And I know what you're saying is compassion and wisdom, well balanced, is part of the solution. But it's hard to get there. And I'm wondering if you can break it down.
Yeah.
The last thing I'm going to say is, I think part of what's difficult is in understanding the teaching is that, the sentence is sounds like a one-time thing, you know, like I accept the wholeness and move on into the healing, whereas the process of healing or the process of feeling the pain and the suffering is continuous and, you know, drawn out in a years-long process. But maybe if there's a way of breaking it down for this situation, it would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
First of all, I'm very, very sorry for what happened to your sister. I have no idea how difficult it must be, but I'm sure it's very difficult financially, emotionally, all kinds of ways. And you said it shouldn't have happened.
Right.
And legally, that may be true, but at the same time, it did happen.
Right.
And then going to that sentence at the end of how what I'm saying seems to sort of imply a one-time understanding versus an ongoing working with the suffering, the pain, the confusion, the anger that's coming up moment to moment to moment, all the frustration. So I'm not in any way suggesting here or implying that it's an easy thing to do, that coming back to compassion when some doctor made a mistake and it's so deeply affected your family, to go beyond being angry. The Dalai Lama is the head of the Tibetan government, the Tibetan religion, not the government now, I guess. But he knows that his fellow countrymen are being murdered, raped, and tortured by the Chinese. And yet he keeps his heart open to the Chinese. He calls them my friend, the enemy, the Chinese. Now, your question, and I think it's the most important question, is how do we do that? It sounds great to say, well, the Dalai Lama does it, right? Or Maharaji does it. How do I, who have a job and financial responsibilities and medical responsibilities, how do I do that? I have a PhD in mathematics. My approach to spirituality is as practical as it can be. I don't care about meditation if it's not something that you can't integrate into your life moment to moment to moment. And I am in my own personal practice and in being a meditation teacher for 45 years now. The bio you guys are using is about 10 years out of date. When it said 35 years, I ought to say 45 years. But what I've seen is that people tend to be disembodied, particularly when there is deep suffering. When you start thinking about your sister, when you start thinking about what the doctor did or didn't do, it's easy to just get lost in the mind. And there's this ongoing cycle of thought. Why did it happen? Why did it happen? And I find that there is a very practical healing process that applies to every situation. I call it the tantric 3-step. It's as opposed to the country's two-step. It's this other dance. And I'll tell you what the 3 steps are. And you don't really have to be able to dance. Okay, so the first step is Vipassana, Hinayana practice, Theravada practice brought into the body. Can I be with what I'm feeling and let go of the narrative? Let go of the story. So there's your sister, there's the lawsuit, there's the day-to-day caregiving. All that stuff is going on. It's not going to go away until it goes away. But right now it's happening. Okay, so is it possible to then, for not all day long, but occasionally at least, to be with what it feels like to be you? Well, this is your life. What does it feel like in your heart? What does it feel like in your belly? What does it feel like in your ear? What does it feel like beyond the story, beyond the narrative? Just intimately, nakedly, directly meeting the situation in your body. And if thoughts come up, you notice them, but you're not getting lost in the story. The story is so compelling. It's a tragic story, admittedly. Okay. But just occasionally let go of the story, be with what's going on. And then the second stage is primarily what we've been talking about today, of having a compassionate relationship with the part of you that's suffering. Okay. So that the qualities of the compassionate heart are a connected heart, a spacious heart. Spacious means there's not a lot of concepts, particularly the concept of I, me, mine floating around, and a warm heart. Can you go into the heart, whatever that means to you, even though this thing has happened to your sister, even though you feel the way you do, even though the medical, financial, legal, all these things are going on. Can you be in your heart occasionally and begin to form a loving relationship with that part of yourself? Suffering is grace. There can be pain. There can be illness. There can be all these things without suffering. So we're training ourselves to work directly with the suffering rather than getting lost in the story. Okay, so that's the Mahayana stage. You're bringing in compassion, that the relationship with the experience is more important than the content. You still got to deal with the content. You've got to deal with the lawyers and the doctors and the caregivers and all that stuff. But can you do it with an open heart? Can you have compassion for the place in you, in your sister? And can you even have compassion for the doctor who made the mistake? My brother, David, died of pancreatic cancer on Halloween in 2014. And he was informed of his terminal prognosis by his Oakland Kaiser oncologist in an after-hours email. The guy didn't want to tell him. He sent an email at 7 o'clock saying, well, we're putting you on palliative care. There's nothing more we can do. So it's easy to have compassion for my brother. Can we have compassion for the doctor? Can we have compassion for your sister's doctor? And as long as you're blaming the doctor, as long as you're mad at the doctor, there's more healing in your heart that has to happen. So that's the second stage of the Tantric 3 steps. The third stage is the Vajrayana, the Tantric step, that even this is sacred. Everything is sacred. Everything is pure consciousness. It doesn't mean there's not suffering. It doesn't mean there's not pain and illness and all these things happening in the world. Of course they're happening. But we don't see any impurities anymore. It's kind of like going to that healing stage, or at least almost to the healing stage. Not to the place of non-duality yet, but at least to the tantric stage of there aren't mistakes, there aren't impurities, that this is everybody's karma unfolding, which does not in any sense diminish the pain, the sadness, those feelings. They're there. We're not pretending they're not there, but we're understanding there's a wisdom component here that even this is part of the divine unfolding. As horrible as it is, COVID and AIDS and all the horrible things we can think of, it's part of the unfolding of consciousness, which doesn't mean, once again, we don't do everything we can to alleviate suffering. Okay, so I see a couple of people with their hands up there. Jim and Juan.
All right. I think Juan was first. Go ahead.
Okay. Dale, I just, well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for your talk. I think that what happens with me in those talks is that I feel like, well, we all come like with our own baggage of what's going on in our lives. And then like we hear some of those teachings, and sometimes there's a beautiful meeting inside of my heart, like in today that happened. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to just like open a little bit of like what I feel today, and hear a little bit of like what your thoughts are on this. So I think that ever since I started practicing, it became very clear that I do have some characteristic that either comes from like genetics or like the way that I was raised, which is I feel a lot of energy from people, especially human beings, some animals too, but especially human beings. And that's obviously a good thing sometimes and a horrible thing sometimes. So I think like it's great because I feel a lot of connection with people and so on, but sometimes my mind goes into thinking about the judgments that people are having towards me. And in this day and age of like social media, I think that becomes an even greater problem sometimes, because ever since I've heard these teachings, right? Like I got so excited about them. They changed my life. They open up like this healing process towards me and people around me that is like so powerful. And I feel like I want to bring this up like to everyone that I know, like and I think that it's kind of like cool that I like hang out with people that never practice, because sometimes like they can get to know these things because of me, and so there are two things that like keep coming up like and keep bothering me with this. One is that, to be honest, ever since I started practicing, I stopped posting on social media. Like that energy brought me like to post a bunch of things on social media before I started practicing. It shut that down because I think like all my posts were for like wrong reasons back then. And like one thing that comes up now is that like I feel like there is like beautiful things to be said and I should just be saying them. And like every once in a while I do that, but then I think about judgments and like that creates some anxiety. But the other space that also appears a lot for me is that is actually with my Zen practice. So I came into practice through Zen, and I love my teacher. Obviously, she saved my life. I mean, she changed my life at least. And I think she has like a very flexible view about Zen. And even though like Zen is very focused on emptiness, it has its form, right? And its form, I don't think it's supposed to be used as a judgment, but that's how I use it too. And I think that because of that, I have a hard time actually digging in deeper in my Zen practice, because I feel like it seems to me like the story that I have in my mind is that like if I want to be a Zen Buddhist, I need to have a form that I don't have. And I feel like that also like.
What do you mean by that? A form that you don't have? I don't understand.
So I what I mean by that is like things like I shouldn't be so centered about like the way that I'm going to be perceived by other people, because that's just like, well, and probably I shouldn't, but like it's more like I have like this high paying job that like I live in San Francisco. I bought a place in San Francisco, like it's kind of like and at the same time I'm like I think a lot like about sexuality. Like I think like my concept of like what is misusing sexuality is kind of like a little different than what I hear from them. And like even like drugs, like it's something that like I feel like there's like one of the precepts is like don't use. I just
okay. So I'm going to have to cut you off. I mean,
sorry.
The question's gone on far longer than the answer's going to happen. We got a couple other people.
sorry, go for it. Yeah.
No, so there's. And you have some very complex questions there. And I'm going to give really simplistic answers because of time constraints. The first thing is the enemy of the open heart is grief. And what that creates is not having appropriate boundaries. So you're saying you're open to people, some animals, but sometimes too much is coming in. And if you can be centered, which Zen really emphasizes a lot, being down in your heart, down in the belly, the energy that accumulates and that flows through the hara, the sea of chi is what hara actually means, is the chi that we create boundaries with. And so at times, if you're walking down the street and there's a lot of people around, or you're at a work environment where people are aggressive or something, or you're with somebody who you want to be more intimate with, it's useful to look at your boundaries. Boundaries can exclude, boundaries can include. If you're feeling overwhelmed by all the energy, you have a boundary that keeps all that stuff out there. If you're with one or two other people, or I'm in a group now and I have a boundary that includes everybody in the room, I can do that. There are books about this. We don't have time to go into this, but I think that's really pointing directly to the first part of your question. The second part, when you're talking about you should be doing things differently, that Zen might be looking at you in a certain way, is that I think you need to change your focus a little bit to how you're judging yourself. And the superego, the inner critic, is a very difficult voice to heal in terms of meditation practice. We believe it. It's been introjected. We learned this voice at a time when we were very young, and it's the voice that we think helps us survive. So whenever you hear some voice saying, you're doing it wrong, feel what that's like. If it's something that's putting you down, you're not strong enough, adequate enough, your sexuality is wrong, your approach is wrong, whatever the voice is saying, can you be with that? Can that just be something else you're paying attention to, just like your breath? Because that voice is so seductive that we really jump into that and believe it. And if you would like to, if anybody has any questions that we're not going to get to today and you want to shoot me an email, go to livingdying.org, and there's an email address there, and there's a phone number, and we could talk another time. Jim, do you have a quick thing you want to bring out?
You've been very helpful. I've been dealing with a lot of death in my personal life, and one of who was the only child of beloved cousins, and they are in a whole different dimension of grief.
Yeah.
That I've really ever been close to, because he was their only child, and he fought hard. He was, the last days he was taking both chemo and morphine so he could maybe live to raise his kids. It's it's very wearing being around that. And but what your comment about the chi, I can be present to them and be more contained. So that's why I appreciate your comment about that, because I come back from seeing them sort of wiped out.
Okay.
So thank you.
So at the same time, is it possible to let your heart be to realize that your heart is so much vaster than your mind thinks it is, that your heart of compassion is vast enough to not only include the suffering of these loved ones, but all the suffering in the world. Mm-hmm. Everybody who's had COVID, dying of COVID, their family, everybody's got cancer, all of that. The heart is that vast. And that it's caregiving is a spiritual practice. Being with people who are suffering is a spiritual practice. Mm-hmm. Can you be with them, just like I was suggesting to Juan? And when you notice that place where you're starting to get tired, where there's an emotional reactivity, then you need compassion for yourself. That we often go into a situation and say, they're suffering more than I am, I've got to be there for them. Mm-hmm. And we lose track of how we're getting caught in ourselves. So it's a very fluid dance back and forth between you getting caught, you opening up, you being with them, then something grabs you again, and having compassion for yourself allows you to be with people who are suffering a lot. If you can't have compassion for those places that are causing you to get exhausted, then there's more work to do. And if you really want to be free, then those places that are exhausting you is a great opportunity to take the next step. So I think we're probably out of time here. I don't want to get in trouble.
Thank you.
You're going to get in big trouble.
Okay.
But Jeff, do you have something quickly you want to say in a minute or so?
You basically addressed it. I'm just stuck a little bit. My memories, for example, of working on an AIDS ward for 5 years during the height of the pandemic, or the crisis, was I went in there with a lot of years, so I thought anyway, of spiritual practice, therapy, psychedelics, all my self-growth things. Ram Dass was my teacher, and he kept saying, "What a good job you have! What a good job you have!" And so I got so burned out, I felt like I could have died not taking care of myself, as you point out. And my sponsor called me spiritually butch.
Well, my next gig is I'm going to be the Buddhist meditation teacher on death row in San Quentin.
Oh, wow.
So I'll have to be watching any place where I might start getting caught up there too.
Mhm. My biggest place was fear of dying, basically, overwhelmed and not being able to carry it and all that stuff. But
well, if we really maybe there isn't time to this, but you're angry about something. If you really pay attention to anger, almost always underneath there's sadness. That things are the way they are. If you pay attention to the sadness underneath that, there's fear. And if you pay attention to that, underneath that is fear of death. And if you pay attention to that, underneath that is love. And if you pay attention to that, underneath that is liberation. So there's like any place you find yourself stuck, you can use it as the gateway to openness. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And do we have any announcements before we close today?
Yes. 2 weeks from today, we're going to meditate back at Bartlett Street, the San Francisco Buddhist Center. And look for an email. Jeff and I are going to go over to see how many places socially distanced we can fit within the facility to accommodate as many people as we can. We may have to set a limit for that for the time being. So you'll be getting an announcement through the email about how it's going to unfold. Zoom we're going to shake down our Zoom technology so we can continue to include people who are at a distance or who are not yet comfortable in a group setting like that. But the San Francisco Buddhist Center is beginning to have meetings there too, so we don't feel like we're being premature in returning. So hopefully it will be a great homecoming. So look for an email with more details.
We'll be masked and vaxxed.
Yes.
Any other announcements?
And boost it if you can.
Dale, would you like to take us through a dedication of merit, a closing?
I'd rather someone else do that. I'm not a very formal Buddhist. I don't really know how to do that.
Okay, I know how to read it, so I'll do it.
Okay, that's great.
By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity, without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dale. Thanks, Joe.
Dale.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Don't forget to leave a little donation, a little Donna.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.